business. Ryan Brown joins us on the Farm Bureau guest line. Check out favrates.com and go with the home team, Mississippi Farm Bureau. Ryan, I don't know if you've had this experience or not, but as I have bumped into people over the last few days, they were like, man, you guys really hadn't had anything to talk about lately, have you? Sarcasm intended. Same for you in the state of Alabama, right?
Yeah, I get that almost every Sunday at church, Richard. I'll be like, walking, down the hallway to the service, and people, oh, you got a lot to talk about tomorrow, and I'm like, yeah, that's what we call football season. And you throw in 2 coaching searches in this state, both of which have wrapped up in the last couple of days. One of them bigger than the other, obviously. And yeah, there's been plenty on the plate. Oh, and by the way, they're going to have a college football playoff without Alabama, it appears, and we thought that was against the rules around here.
Yeah, apparently not against the rules. There are probably folks that are going, wait, 2 college searches? So Trent Dilfer, now the head coach at UAB, we don't really have to talk about that, but that news did come out. The news that a lot of people are talking about is Lane Kiffin not the head coach at Auburn. Hugh Freeze is the head coach at Auburn. Press conference, introductory press conference yesterday. Let's start big, and then we'll kind of tighten up from there. Give me a big picture thought on the last 3 weeks leading up to yesterday.
Well, I mean, up until, I guess the day or two after the Egg Bowl, really, I guess Saturday after the Egg Bowl, I think everyone in Auburn would have told you it was Lane Kiffin. And certainly, and I don't have to remind Ole Miss fans of this, I think the performance by Ole Miss against Arkansas and the performance by Ole Miss in the second half of the Egg Bowl, especially there late, had the hallmarks of a coach that was on his way out. I mean, you see this all the time, and you saw it with Hugh Freeze, frankly. But, I mean, everything pointed at Lane Kiffin, and I think everyone in and around Auburn would have told you it was Lane Kiffin's job. And that was just the expectation. So I think there was a great deal of surprise when word started leaking out Friday, and then it got confirmed Saturday that Lane Kiffin wasn't coming. And then everybody turned their attention towards Hugh Freeze, because all along it had appeared like, whether you want to call it 1A, 1B, or option A, option B, option 1, option 2, whatever you want to call it, Lane Kiffin appeared to be the lead horse, and Hugh Freeze was always the fallback. So I think everybody knew if the Lane Kiffin deal didn't work out, that Hugh Freeze was going to be the next stop. And I don't think anybody would have been – I think everybody would have been shocked if he'd have said no, right? I mean, Hugh Freeze would have –
oh, yeah, that wasn't happening.
Auburn in the SEC. That was a given, yeah.
There is always an excessive amount of spin at the end of a coaching search with this is the guy that we targeted from the beginning and we got our guy and, oh, yeah, never actually offered a job. Are there people in and around Auburn who are trying to, at least in the aftermath, convince of it, Lane Kiffin, but not really? Or is it just everybody knows they went after Lane Kiffin, they thought they were getting Lane Kiffin, and it just didn't happen?
I think the fan base, the rank and file fan base, knows that. John Cohen is the only person I've heard say that, and I don't even believe John Cohen believes it. Did I get his name right this time?
Yes.
I don't think.
But if you had
Cohen,
not, I promise I would not have corrected you.
I don't think John Cohen even believes that when he says it. I think it's what an athletics director has to say. I mean, I have lived through a ton of these over here. You've lived through them in your state. No athletic director stands up and says, we did a nationwide search and I'm stunned at how many people said no, but we found this guy. I mean, you're never going to say that. I mean, you're always going to pretend like this was the guy we targeted from the beginning. So I'm sure, and John Cohen didn't take questions. He was asked to take questions at the press conference. Those questions were denied. So we don't really know his thought process on it outside of what he has said in a statement and then what he said when introducing Hugh Freeze. But I think everybody realizes that Lane Kiffin was the primary target, and that Auburn always knew they had Hugh Freeze in their back pocket. That with the baggage Hugh has, that I don't have to tell people that listen to this show and watch this show what that baggage is. They all know. With that, if the powers that be at Auburn could stomach that and get past that they knew Hugh Freeze was a guy that would say yes at any time. And frankly, nobody else was going after Hugh Freeze this year. Auburn was apparently the only school that had interest in getting him from Liberty.
Yeah, the only other thing was there was some rumbling about West Virginia, but I don't even know that West Virginia has actually made their mind up about what they're doing, or maybe at this point they have made up their mind and decided to stick with Neil Brown. I thought the press conference itself, can't believe I did that. Hugh Freeze kind of played the hits, right? I mean, he went through the emotional part of thanking his family for standing by him along the way and learning from mistakes and all that stuff. And then it was like he took a deep breath and he switched gears and he switched into football mode. And I'm talking about the confidence level. It was like it just shot through the roof of the building.
I mean, you say football mode. He switched to Baptist preacher mode, Deep South Baptist preacher mode.
Okay.
I mean, it was wild. We were live on the air at the time, and my two show hosts that host the show with me, Lance Taylor and Jim Dunaway, when he did it, because it was a very tearful, emotional moment. He said, "I'm not going to get choked up." Then he immediately got choked up, of course, and fought through that, and then like you said, just took a deep breath. And buddy, it was like a switch flipped, and we were at a tent revival, and we all said the same thing. That's what it felt like. It felt like he was preaching, and he won the press conference, but nobody's surprised at that with Hugh Freeze. I mean, he's an engaging guy. He is a charismatic guy. He would have, if it's all about a press conference, he's going to blow Lane Kiffin out of the water. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. So you knew what you were getting with him, but you're absolutely right. And once he started down that road, it was salesman. He was selling his product. And he got to ask a couple of the tougher questions. He got to ask, your normal softball layups, that he's prepared for. And, all in all, I think everybody that liked the hire left even more excited. If you didn't like the hire, there were probably some people that got won over by that.
Yeah. I mean, if you're just giving a letter grade to that press conference yesterday, it was as solid an A as A's go. I mean, there was nothing to, even the slightly more difficult questions. I mean, there was a plan on how he was going to answer those because he knew it. And now it turns to football. And to me, that's where it gets really interesting, right? Because I had somebody at Auburn, you may know better than I, tell me that there may be as many as 45 roster spots that turn over on this roster this year. One, that's difficult. Two, it gives you a chance to flip a roster in a single offseason.
Well, he's going to have to be really good in the transfer portal. There's no doubt about that. Now, normally when you say somebody's got to be good in the transfer portal, everybody immediately goes to quarterback. And, Robbie Ashford has shown some raw ability, but I honestly believe he's the type of quarterback Hugh Freeze can get something out of. I actually think that's a pretty good marriage. So I'm not entirely certain you go quarterback shopping. Now, look, if something presents itself and you look at it and you're like, I cannot say no to that, maybe you do it. But I'm not certain quarterback is the immediate place they'll go. They absolutely have to have help at offensive line. It has been a problem at Auburn. Gus Malzahn recruited offensive line poorly, especially late in his time there. Brian Harsin just recruited poorly overall in his time there. So offensive line has to have help. So that's step one. You've got to fix your offensive line. And then you've got to see, I don't anticipate, I can't verify the number you were told, 45, but I think it'll be a lot. And who knows who hits the portal? I mean, we've already seen today some guys that actually were productive at Alabama, like Trayshawn Holden at receiver, has entered the portal. So just because a guy has a good year doesn't necessarily mean they're going to stick around for a new coach. So, yeah, I mean, I think there'll be a revolving door there, and he'll have to. The recruiting has not gone well. There's a signing day coming up. He's behind the eight ball there. It is going to have to be heavy transfer portal for him over these next few weeks.
Do you get, and we may have to carry this into the next segment if there's not enough time here, but sure. Do you get there's been so much talk about NIL and the amount of money that is there and is available. Is it going to be like spending like a drunken sailor in terms of building the roster, or do you think they're going to be careful with how they go about promising, distributing, et cetera? Well, I think we got about 30 seconds till the break.
Okay. Yeah, and I can do that in 30 seconds. It's difficult to answer because they weren't doing it under Brian Harsin. So I don't know what their philosophy is, but they were very disorganized. And that's one thing about the NIL is they finally have found some organization and have some centralization. So I do think it's in strong shape. How they use it remains to be seen just because we haven't seen them really effectively do it yet.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how it goes. We will we'll talk SEC bowl picture. Ryan said something a second ago. We didn't know that they were allowed to have a college football playoff without the University of Alabama. And I guess there's still like a crazy outside shot that maybe they could get in, but it would take a weird, wild weekend. Seems unlikely. Farm Bureau guest line. When you look at the Hugh Freeze to Auburn thing, I think most people look at it and go, okay, he's going to win. He's built programs, but the question is about sustaining, and will it be good enough for Auburn over a long enough period of time? And whether you look at Ole Miss or Liberty, the highs were really high. There were some lows, and sometimes the lows, in terms of football, almost immediately follow the highs. I mean, you think about the 2015 season for Ole Miss. They beat Alabama, but they lost to Memphis that year. It's like, How do you make all that work? What do you think the football piece of it is going to look like?
And that year you mentioned, it's funny, we were talking about that the other day because that year benefited Alabama, the Arkansas play, right? The Hunter Henry toss over the shoulder to Alex Collins. And we still marvel at that play. I know Ole Miss fans do not want me to bring this up, but there literally were 21
But
guys.
I'm sure Brian Haydad is fine, so, talk about it all you want. Right, Haydad?
So,
you have my attention.
Haydad knows this. So, I mean, Hunter Henry's got the ball. There are 21 other guys on the field. The one guy you wanted it to go to was Alex Collins, and it bounces right up in his hands. I mean, it's crazy. But that play sent Alabama to Atlanta. And I will tell you, there are a lot of Auburn fans that are like, I mean, look, that was a one in a million shot at that happening and keeping him out of Atlanta. And with all due respect to Ole Miss, a lot of Auburn fans say if he can get Ole Miss to Atlanta, he can get Auburn to Atlanta. And frankly, I mean, Richard, Brian Harsin notwithstanding, because he coached a year and a half, everybody that's gone there. I mean, from Pat Dye to Terry Bowden to Tommy Tuberville to Gene Chizik, all these guys got fired, by the way. Gene Chizik, Gus Malzahn, they've all, gotten to Atlanta. They've all had a really good year. They, by and large, have come close to or won a national championship or come close to winning one or been in the hunt for one. So, I mean, pretty much everybody that goes there at least has one of those years. But what you just described with Hugh Freeze is kind of what Auburn football has been: great highs and painful lows, and that's what it was under Gus Malzahn a lot of times.
And the thing is, so you mentioned it, right, with a bunch of coaches. You got to go back. I don't know how far you go back to find a coaching situation at Auburn that didn't end kind of ugly, right? I mean, For everybody to some level. I mean, I guess with Pat Dye, it was kind of NCAA related, and Terry Bowden ends up getting fired, and Tommy Tuberville, it got weird in the middle, and then he recovered, and then it got weird at the end. And Chizik wins a national championship, and 2 years later he's out, and Gus beats Bama a few times, but then they get tired of him. I mean, it always ends bad. Is there any reason to think that this won't eventually also end bad, poorly?
I mean, I think the answer to your question, and I wasn't alive for this, was Shug Jordan, the guy whose name is on the stadium. I think he was able to retire. And now, Richard, we're going back early to mid-'70s for that. Yeah. I can't remember the year Coach Jordan retired. But Doug Barfield took over after him. He got fired, and everybody since then has gotten fired or asked to leave. I mean, you can word it any way you want. So I don't know. I mean, Hugh Freeze will be breaking a 40 or 50-year mold if he doesn't. But look, I mean, Hugh Freeze is a good football coach, obviously, and he knows how to coach a SEC program. We saw that at Ole Miss. If Hugh Freeze at Ole Miss were 0-5 against Alabama and Nick Saban, I don't think he has this job. Now, I'm not saying the only reason he got this job was he was 2-3 in his 5 games against Saban, but buddy, you better believe that helped. I mean, the Auburn fans took note of the fact that in back-to-back seasons, the only other person to have done that was Les Miles in 10 and 11. In back-to-back seasons, he beat Nick Saban. And that went a long way in him being a candidate for this job.
Was Les Miles on the radar for this?
No. My only point with Les Miles is
No, I know what your point was. Okay. I know what your point was. I just was trying to stir it up a little bit.
Yeah, no. They would have hired Ed Orgeron before Les Miles, I think.
One of the things that has stood out to me about Nick Saban Alabama teams is they're always focused. They always play well. The notable exception has been occasionally when they are playing in a bowl game that has no meaning, no bearing on the national championship, you don't get the A-plus performance. If Alabama does not end up in the playoff this year, what are we going to see from them in the Sugar Bowl or the Orange Bowl or whatever?
Yeah. Yeah, in all likelihood, it's the Sugar. For those that don't know,
Probably.
The only way they miss the Sugar is for Tennessee to somehow jump them and be the highest-ranked non-playoff team from the SEC, or if LSU shocks the world Saturday and doesn't make the playoffs. If they're the conference champion and doesn't make the playoffs, they're in the Sugar. So in all likelihood, it's going to be Alabama. And in all likelihood, they're going to catch Kansas State. And you get the feel, Richard, this is going to be Kansas State's Super Bowl. And Alabama is going to go through the motions because that is what has happened. And I think the biggest thing to watch, Bryce Young is going to be a top, in all likelihood, top 5 NFL draft pick. Is he going to play in the game? He's got a legitimate reason with that shoulder that he is, he's had to fight through all year. Will Anderson is going to be a top 5 pick. Will he play in this game? You already got guys today, some of them contributors like Trayshawn Holden hitting the portal. Who's going to be on the roster, and are the guys on the roster engaged in this thing? I mean, that is, to your point, that has been what has plagued Alabama in the rare times that they have missed the playoffs. Going to these bowl games has been really, really tricky just because, this sounds like an arrogant statement for an Alabama fan to say, but there is truth to it. For a lot of teams, getting to the Sugar Bowl is a huge accomplishment. For Alabama, it has been a disappointing season that gets them there.
Yeah. Alabama 6, Tennessee 7. Any surprise, any disagreement in those two things? Is it simply a function of Hendon Hooker's injury?
Yeah, because I think it's as much a function as getting blown out as Hendon Hooker's injury, blown out by South Carolina. Now, it has been an unpopular opinion here, but I maintain Tennessee should be in front of them. I put value in the head-to-head there.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say, well, Tennessee got blown out. Well, that's a team you lost to. I mean, if they got blown out by South Carolina, you lost to a team that got blown out by South Carolina. I mean, you gotta wear that. So I would have Tennessee in front of them. It's fairly irrelevant. I mean, it's the difference in the sugar and the orange. But I would personally have Tennessee in front of them. But everybody was watching last night to see if they were in front of Ohio State. That was the key
one. Is there any combination of results this weekend that gives Alabama a path to the number 4 spot in the playoff?
I personally do not think so. But if you wanted to paint a picture that did it, I think Georgia and Michigan, and I'm almost ready to say TCU are locked in. But let's assume TCU isn't. Georgia and Michigan are, okay? Let's assume TCU isn't. And let's assume TCU loses by 3 touchdowns or 4 touchdowns to Kansas State. That was a blowout in the making before Kansas State had injuries earlier this season. So let's assume Kansas State closes that deal. And then let's assume USC Friday night loses by a couple of touchdowns to Utah. Then, especially USC being a 2-loss non-conference champion, you could easily jump them. TCU's the tricky one. I could see one of the two, Alabama or Ohio State, jumping them. But both of them, and here's the problem with that. If you jump both of them in, you have now created a Final Four that is 2 SEC, 2 Big Ten. And they can say all they want, they don't look at that. But you know good and well, Richard, they look at that. And I don't think that's something that they would want. So I just personally don't see a path for Alabama. I painted you chaos there, and it's even hard for me to thread the needle with that kind of chaos.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. There's nothing that can knock Georgia or Michigan out. Although Michigan losing to Purdue, I still don't think they're falling past 4. I think that would be harder. But yeah, so if you say there are 2 spots up for grabs, it would take 2 blowout losses. I don't even know if 3 touchdowns would be enough with TCU. I mean, it might take them getting beat 46-10.
Yeah.
And then they're like, we're going to put that team in the playoff? We've had questions about them all along. So, I don't know. Do you still enjoy bowl season?
I mean, look, I've always been one that accepts bowl season for what it is. They're exhibition games. And I know a lot of old school fans don't like to hear that, but I've always maintained the bowls outside the playoffs. The bowls mean something to both fan bases and people that are gambling on the game. And to me, it's just, they're exhibition games. I don't have a problem with them. And in fact, I don't even think you ought to have to be 6-6. I think bowls ought to be able to take anybody they want. And I've never been, we got a too many bowls guy. More football the merrier for me. But I just understand that these are exhibition games. They just don't have a ton of meaning.
Last thing for you, and I'll just leave you on a slightly controversial note. Did John Cohen hire Hugh Freeze, or did somebody else do it?
There was influence there. They could say all they want. It was a John Cohen hire, but this is a guy that the power brokers, that are the old Pat Dye people, wanted when Brian Harsin was hired. So if he happened to do this all by himself, he somehow stumbled into the guy that the big power brokers absolutely loved already.
It seems odd that John Cohen would have picked Hugh Freeze all by his lonesome.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I mean,
I'm just saying that based on the state in which I live, but
Oh,
whatever.
I know. Everybody over here realizes that too. Trust me. That is not lost on people in this state either.